Now, there's other concepts of centerline, and so, you could say that, you know, uh, as we consider the physiology of the human body, right? Some people talk about, the center line as a vertical one in the, let's say, the y-axis rather than the z-axis here, right? Going posterior to anterior, or vice versa, as a two-way lane, right? So then you have this idea of a vertical center line, right? That bisects left and right. And a lot of people, I think, they use that as a sort of a mapping of primary striking targets in terms of offense.
Yeah.
And again, I think as a yin yang sort of philosopher, I also think of vice versa always, right? And I think in a previous video, I recommended people, in order to keep learning and keep progressing, is to always work with that kind of yin yang dynamic. As you see in the yin yang diagram, right? It's that curve represents dynamic, not just cut a piece of a pie in half and there you go, right? And you just eat that half, right? So think about the opposite, right? So this is just a little application of that as well. If that's the case, let me flip it and say, okay, if those are vulnerable targets that I want to attack, then that means they're vulnerable targets that I want to protect as a defender, right? And so that's why, in most styles, they don't have their arms open like this as their guard position. They have something where their arms are more medial rather than lateral, right? Yes, more lateral, like the shoulders, and the lateral knee, right? Those are more on the side of the body. Those are vulnerable, right? And I don't want to discount those as targets, right? But some people talk about the vital organs, like, let's say, the bridge of the nose, right? If you hit back, there's the ethmoid bone, which could damage your brain, or the eyes are pretty close here, right? The nose, right? The teeth, right? The tongue, the throat, which has the trachea, the esophagus, the carotid artery, the jugular vein, the cervical spine, right, et cetera, moving down, right? Then you have like the solar plexus, et cetera, down to the genitals, right? And so that, again, it's an abstraction. This vertical center line, right, along the y-axis needs to be defined, because that's sort of your central vital organs, or even the central nervous system is there. Now, that's not a bad definition. It's good to know left from right, right? Even our anatomy internally, left brain, right brain, et cetera, right? However, again, we can take the same idea of overextension of a certain definition of the center line, like prior, the more z-axis center line, that's kind of overly applied. So my point here is then, well, if someone is, let's say, their targets, let's say as an attacker, the defender, or the target person, me as the attacker, their center line is pretty well defended, or like you said, they're turned off, right? So it's not available, it's not full frontal. So, or they have defense, they have their arms here like this now, or somehow you step off to the side, right? You yourself, right, with a kind of a pivoting step or a side step, right? And so does that mean then, I can't attack them because their center line is not accessible, right? Then that's getting a little bit too far, because like you said, I studied biology and physiology, and also practice Chinese medicine, so some familiarity with the human anatomy. And we use needles in acupuncture, right? And I do primarily points off the center line. I almost never needle actually the center line, except maybe some points like in the forehead here to calm down the nervous system. Most of the points are on the forelimbs and the hands and the feet. So that's like the peripheral nervous system. Now, I'll tell you, you can ask my patients, right? Most of the time it's not painful, but they will feel a sensation, or sometimes maybe they do feel, for a moment, like, right, a little jolt of energy. And so my point is that the whole body is one integrated system, right? Connected by all the subsystems, like the circulatory system, right? From like the heart and aorta to these micro capillaries, or the nervous system, right? From the brain and like these bigger kind of nerves that run, efferently to the nerves on the periphery, right? So yes, when I am engaging with a body, whether medically or martially, I do consider where the vertical center line is. However, those aren't the exclusive targets that I use, right? And so one good target, for instance, that's off the center line, right, is, let's say, the ribs, right, the intercostals, where underneath is the liver, let's say on the right side, right? So say I sidestep, to the person's right, right, and their face, their throat, their solar plexus, their genital, right, they're not available. And so does that mean I don't, attack, or I don't have options to attack? No, actually, I would immediately strike off their center line, right? So that's a more planar idea of the center line. Oh, here it's accessible frontal. But another way to kind of, make it a little bit more flexible is that don't think of it just as a planar thing. Think of it three-dimensional. So there is a point from the crown of the head down to the base where the perineum is. And so in the example where I'm hitting from an angle, not frontally, let's say to the liver, I am still directing my strike in towards that kind of pole, right? So rather than kind of hitting, say this is the person's body, right? Their liver is over here. So I'm not just skimming off to one side. I'm still hitting towards their, let's say, vertical center line, right? That way, when you strike, you're not just going to turn them, right? Unless that's the point. You can, no problem with that. Maybe you want to turn them, right? Then you would hit off center, so you get some of that lateral leverage, right? But if your idea is to really say, break something, right, or knock them back, then it's good if you attack towards that, sort of like if you think of a wheel, right, and you have an axle running vertically through that hub, right, like this. This metaphor is to understand that all spokes, right, all the spokes of the wheel, they go towards that hub axis, right? And so that's a good idea, whether you're hitting from, let's say, 6 o'clock or 12 o'clock or 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock, right, or 7:30, right? You want to hit towards that middle. That way you're going to affect their balance more, right? If you hit off that, then they might spin, they might rotate, right? So that's another way to elaborate this idea of the vertical definition of the center line.
Yeah, two things. So I like the way what you said, where there are other targets, because even when I practice with people or see other people practicing, I mean, you get pretty predictable if your target is the same spot. So if you're like center line, I guess, or what this point here, if you're that dominant, it's like, okay, I know where you're going to to strike each time now. So
predictable. Yeah,
you're pretty predictable.